As 17-year-old Juliane Koepcke plummeted 10,000 feet through the air, she looked down at the Amazon rainforest and thought to herself that the canopy looked just like heads of broccoli. Strapped to her seat and hurtling towards the ground at 45 meters per second, Juliane expected these giant green florets to be the last thing she ever saw. But when she woke up the next day, injured and alone in the Amazon rainforest, she realized that her troubles were only just beginning. Juliane Koepcke was born on the 10th of October 1954 in Lima, Peru, and was the only child of German parents Maria and Hans Wilhelm Koepcke. Maria and Hans met at the University of Kiel, where both majored in biology. In late 1948, Hans was offered a job at the Natural History Museum in Lima, which he gladly accepted. However, being German, Hans faced some difficulty with post-World War II travel, and in order to reach Peru, he trekked over several mountain ranges, was arrested, and served time in an Italian prison camp, before finally burrowing into a huge pile of rock salt, which was stowed away in the hold of a cargo ship bound for Uruguay. Once he arrived in South America, he began the 4,000-kilometer-plus trek to Peru. By the time Hans finally arrived at the museum, 2 years after first accepting the job offer, the director told him that the position had already been filled. However, Hans persevered and was eventually offered a job managing the ichthyology collection. Maria made her way over to Peru in 1950 on a South Pacific steamer. She was also hired at the museum, managing the ornithology department, and the couple went on to marry in Peru. Together, Hans Wilhelm and Maria co-authored many scientific publications before eventually developing a biological research station based in the Amazon rainforest in 1968 when Juliane was 14 years old. Juliane said that she had a very lucky upbringing and was particularly close with her mother, often joining her parents on expeditions from a young age. At first, she was less than excited to leave her school friends behind in Lima, but she quickly fell in love with life in the Amazon. In her memoir, Juliane wrote of her home. It was gorgeous, an idyll on the river with trees that bloomed blazing red. There were mango, guava, and citrus fruits, and over everything, a glorious 150-foot-tall lupuna tree, also known as a kapok. The Koepckes lived in the research station, named Panguana, with their German shepherd, named Lobo, and a parrot called Tobias or Bayo to a young Juliane. Panguana was set in the Peruvian Amazon, and was developed with the aim to explore the biodiversity of flora and fauna while studying the ecological relationships in the area. Originally, Panguana was only designed to accommodate field researchers for a period of 5 years, and an abandoned wood cabin with a roof made of palm leaves served as accommodation. In 1972, Panguana became an official scientific research area, and a larger house has since replaced the original wood cabin. Due to their remote location, Juliane was homeschooled and had a slightly unconventional education, with a focus on learning survival skills, identifying bird calls, and studying the native wildlife and flora. Peru's authorities disapproved of her untraditional education, and as a result, Juliane was required to return to Lima in March of 1970 to complete her exams at Deutsche Schule Lima Alexander von Humboldt. But after working so hard for her diploma, Juliane wanted to attend her graduation ceremony and ball on the 23rd of December. Maria agreed, but the pair were still determined to get back home before Christmas, so they could spend the holiday with Hans. They decided to take a flight on the 24th of December. Being Christmas Eve, most flights were fully booked. Maria was struggling to find seats, but eventually she came across LANSA Flight 508, bound for Iquitos, with a stopover in Pucallpa, where the pair planned to depart. This particular aircraft was a Lockheed L-188 Electra, and they had earned a reputation for being less than safe, following a series of crashes in the 1960s, including at least 2 incidents where the aircraft had broken apart mid-air. Following these accidents, wind tunnel tests were conducted at NASA's Langley Research Center. These tests indicated a stiffness in the Electra's engine, which had triggered an interaction known as whirl mode, resulting in a catastrophic fluttering of the wing. Lockheed went on to strengthen the wings and redesign the engine mounts, nacelles, and cowlings, but the damage to their reputation had been done, and ultimately only 170 of the aircrafts were ever built. In addition to this, LANSA itself also had a pretty poor reputation, with their first fatal crash in April 1966, resulting in the death of all 49 people on board. This was followed by a second crash in August of 1970, which proved fatal to all but one passenger, as well as 2 people on the ground, and failure on the part of the pilot to follow correct engine shutdown procedures had caused the crash. As a result, the airline received a 90-day suspension and a lot of negative press. Hans was aware of this and, as such, told Maria not to take the flight, but it was the only one with seats available, and so they had no alternatives if they wanted to spend Christmas together. Knowing this, Maria went ahead and purchased 2 seats on the Lockheed L-188 Electra, LANSA's last working aircraft, departing Lima for Iquitos via Pucallpa on the 24th of December. After a short delay, Maria and Juliana gathered for boarding and made their way onto the plane for the hour-long trip home. Juliana was seated in 19F, a window seat beside her mother. After takeoff, the plane climbed to 21,000 feet. Being a nervous flyer, Maria was on edge when the passenger plane flew into a cauldron of pitch-black clouds around 40 minutes into their flight, telling Juliana, "I don't like this." Juliana managed to stay comparatively calm, as the interior of the plane was illuminated by flashes of lightning, and baggage began to fly from the overhead lockers due to the turbulence. Maria murmured to her daughter, "I hope this goes all right." It was then that Juliana looked out the window and saw a bolt of lightning strike the wing of the plane in the fuel tank, and the plane began to nosedive. From her seat at the rear of the plane, Juliana could see into the cockpit and recalls her mother calmly saying, "Now it's all over." The sound of people screaming and the motor roaring filled her ears, and then all of a sudden there was only wind. The plane had begun to disintegrate mid-air, and Juliana, who was likely the only one in her row wearing a seatbelt, spiraled down into the heart of the Amazon rainforest, totally alone. As she plummeted 10,000 feet through the sky, she looked down at the Amazon rainforest and thought that the canopy looked just like heads of broccoli. Strapped to her seat and hurtling towards the ground at 45 meters per second, Juliana passed in and out of consciousness, fully expecting these giant green florets to be the last thing she would ever see. When she opened her eyes the next day, Juliana noticed that her seatbelt was now undone, indicating that she had woken up at some point, undone her belt, and slipped back into unconsciousness. She was covered in mud, her thin summer dress completely soaked, and she had crawled underneath the seat in an attempt to stay dry. Juliana felt so weak that she stayed beneath the 3-seat bench for the rest of the day and night. Upon waking the next morning, she said that she felt abandoned, helpless, and utterly alone. Juliana had a very obviously broken collarbone, a strained vertebrae, a partially fractured shin, a cut on her arm and calf, a torn anterior cruciate ligament, a concussion, and seriously compromised eyesight. Juliana was nearsighted, and her glasses were missing. Her left eye was swollen shut, and she could only see out of a narrow slit in her right eye. In addition to this, the sudden change in altitude had caused many of the capillary vessels in Juliana's eyes to burst, and while this didn't cause any pain, her eyes were extremely bloodshot as a result. In addition, Juliana had also lost a shoe during the fall, leaving her with only one sandal. Straining to see, she looked down at her watch, a gift from her grandmother, and discovered that it was 9 a.m. Juliana crawled around on her hands and knees, searching for her mother, but she found no wreckage nearby. While searching for Maria, Juliana discovered a bag of candy. Aware that this would likely be crucial to her survival, she ate a piece and saved the rest for later. After checking the immediate vicinity, Juliana memorized the markings on a nearby tree so that she wouldn't become disoriented, and began walking in a wider circle searching for her mother, calling for her, but receiving no answer. The plane crash had prompted the biggest search and rescue effort in Peru's history, but due to the dense forest, rescuers were unable to find any wreckage, let alone survivors. Juliana could hear planes humming overhead, but she knew that to be seen by rescuers, she needed to get out of the thick canopy of the jungle. She also knew that in the Amazon, that would be a difficult feat. When the humming began to fade that day, she noticed a trickling sound and followed it to a small spring, which was feeding a rivulet. Juliana remembered what her father had taught her years before. If she was ever lost, she should find a body of water to follow, the bigger the better, and that would eventually lead her to civilization. She began following the rivulet, and after a while it turned into a stream, which she continued to follow for a number of days. On the 28th of December, Juliana's only source of food, the bag of candy she had found the day after the crash, ran out. Since it was the rainy season, there were hardly any fruits or berries for her to pick, and she had no tools to cut up roots or catch fish to eat. Having grown up in the jungle, Juliana knew not to risk eating anything she didn't recognize, as much of what grows in the Amazon is poisonous. And so drinking water from the stream was her only source of sustenance for much of her journey through the jungle. As she followed the stream, Juliana heard the sound of king vultures, and she began to fear that meant there was a dead human nearby. After coming around a turn in the stream, she discovered 3 people in a row of seats, which had been drilled 3 feet into the ground from the force of the impact. Upon seeing a woman's feet poking up out of the ground, Juliana became worried it was her mother, but upon lifting up the woman's feet with a stick, she saw that her toenails were painted, something that her mother never did. Juliana's watch also stopped working on the 28th, and it became more difficult for her to keep track of the days. Finally, the stream Juliana had been following turned into a small river. Throwing her single black sandal at the ground in front of her in an attempt to frighten away snakes, Juliana made her way down the river bank. On the 29th or 30th of December, Juliana heard the unmistakable buzzing call of the Hoatzin bird. She remembered her mother, who specialized in ornithology, telling her that you only hear Hoatzin birds near large bodies of water, where people settled. Juliana made the hard choice to leave the small river she had been following, walking towards the call of the bird. This eventually paid off, and Juliana came to a large river. She could still hear planes in the distance, but eventually the sound began to fade, and Juliana believed that the rescuers had either rescued everyone but her or had given up searching. Juliana felt angry that they were turning around now, after she had struggled for days to reach open water, where she could be seen more easily, but she refused to give up. After having spent so much time in the jungle, she knew that where there were rivers, there were usually people. Continuing to make her way along the river, some areas became so overgrown that Juliana could no longer hike along the edges of it, and instead made the decision to get in the river. She was aware that stingrays rested in the riverbed, so she walked carefully at first, poking the mud in front of her with a stick, before deciding that it would be faster and less dangerous to swim in the middle of the river. Stingrays don't like to venture into the deep water, and piranhas typically only attack in shallow standing water. Juliana has said that she expected to encounter caimans on her trip down the river, and in fact she saw many, with some even diving into the water when they saw her, but she said she was never afraid of them, as she knew they did not generally attack people. By day, she made her way down the river, and each night, Juliana would stop to find a safe place to sleep and would gather up a pile of leaves to try to keep warm throughout the night. Mosquitoes and midges made rest difficult, though, as they buzzed around her head, biting her and trying to crawl into her ears and nose. On nights when it rained, Juliana cowered underneath a tree or bush, the ice-cold rain soaking through her summer dress, and the wind chilling her to the core. One morning, Juliana felt a sharp pain in her upper back. She reached around to touch it, and when she looked down at her hand, she saw that it was covered in blood. It would turn out that Juliana had sustained second-degree burns to most of her body from the constant sun exposure as she swam downstream. As the days went by, Juliana grew progressively weaker and started experiencing auditory and visual hallucinations, often becoming convinced that she could see the roof of a house or hear chickens clucking. She fantasized about food often, thinking about everything from elaborate feasts to simple meals that she missed. Juliana noticed that while the monkeys and deer near Panguana would stay away from humans, the animals here seemed either curious or unfazed, and it dawned on her that the animals here might never have seen a human being before. Looking at the river, she also noticed there were a lot of logs, a sign there aren't many frequent travelers. Juliana knew the reality of the Amazon. There are vast swaths of uninhabited land where nobody goes for decades or perhaps even centuries at a time. Juliana tried to push those thoughts out of her head and carried on. Although she had no way of knowing it, LANSA 508 had crashed just 30 miles away from Panguana, and she was close to home. She was beginning to feel more and more hopeless as the days wore on, wondering if there was any point in continuing. By this stage, Juliana's arm had become severely infected. Botflies had laid larvae in her wound, and they had begun to eat away at her flesh. No matter what she did, she couldn't remove the maggots and began to fear that she might lose her arm. Somehow, Juliana managed to find the strength to keep going and spent her 10th day drifting downstream, climbing over logs, and trying not to become injured by debris in the water. That evening, she found a gravel bank and drifted off to sleep for a few minutes. When she woke up, she saw a small boat. Juliana rubbed her eyes, looked away, and looked back again, but the boat was still there. She swam over and touched it, still not fully believing what she saw was real. Nearby, she noticed a worn trail that led up the riverbank, and although she was sure that she would find people there, Juliana was so weak that it took her hours to make it up the 9-foot-tall embankment. At the top of the trail, she found a small shelter and spotted a path leading from the shack into the forest. While at the shack, she found a tank of diesel fuel and remembered watching her father treat a similar wound on their family dog using kerosene. Juliana found a small tube for sucking up diesel and poured it into the wound on her arm in an effort to disinfect it. While the pain was excruciating, it brought most of the maggots to the surface, and she was able to pick out around 30 of them. As the sun began to set and nobody emerged from the forest, she contemplated taking the boat to try and find help, but did not want to steal it and decided to spend the night instead. The ground in the hut was too hard, and so she took a tarp to the riverbank and slept in the sand for the night. When she awoke the next morning, Juliana was still alone, and it began to rain. Crawling into the shelter, she wrapped the tarp around her shoulders in an effort to stay dry. In the afternoon, the rain stopped, but Juliana no longer had the strength to stand. She decided to stay to rest for one more day, and then planned to keep going. At twilight, on the 3rd of January, Juliana began to hear voices. At first, she was almost certain that she was imagining them, but the voices continued to grow closer, and eventually 3 local forestry workers emerged from the trees, stopping in shock when they saw her. At first, they were afraid of Juliana, believing that she might be a water spirit called Yemanja, known for their blonde hair and pale appearance. Fortunately, Juliana spoke fluent Spanish and was able to tell the men, "I'm a girl who was in the LANSA crash. My name is Juliana." The men had heard about the crash on the radio, and they let her stay the night in their hut. They fed her cassava, tended to her wounds, and then the next morning they took her downstream in a canoe to the nearest village, where she was airlifted to a nearby hospital by a local missionary pilot. It was here Juliana was reunited with her father. The search for LANSA Flight 508 had been called off after 10 days, and once she was well enough, Juliana was able to give the rescue parties directions, allowing them to locate the crash site, along with the bodies of many victims. On January 12, 1972, search parties located the body of Maria Koepcke. It was found that as many as 14 other passengers, including Maria, had survived the initial crash, but had all died while waiting to be rescued. When Hans went to identify Maria's body, he told Juliana that he thought she had survived for almost 2 weeks, perhaps as far as January 6th, but had likely suffered a severe injury to her back or pelvis during the fall, and was unable to move as a result. All passengers were found and removed from the jungle. Exploring the cause of the crash, Peruvian investigators cited intentional flight into hazardous weather conditions, likely in an effort to meet holiday demands. As a result, LANSA lost its operating permit on January 4, 1972. However, the airline had already ceased operation, having lost its last working aircraft in the crash on December 24th. Juliane believes a number of factors contributed to saving her life that day. Juliane was sitting at a window seat in a row of 3, and much like a maple helicopter seat would, it's thought that the row of seats made a spiraling motion as it fell, slowing her descent. Juliane has speculated that a powerful updraft from the thunderstorm may also have contributed to slowing her fall. Finally, Juliane suggested that the thick canopy of the jungle below her likely broke her fall, and the seat she was still strapped to had protected her from grievous harm on the way down through the trees. Following the crash, Juliane returned to Germany in 1972, and Hans Wilhelm followed 2 years later. Juliane's story was turned into a fictionalized film titled Miracles Still Happen in 1974, in which she was portrayed by actress Susan Penhaligon. Juliane's tale was more accurately told in Werner Herzog's 1998 documentary titled Wings of Hope. Juliane herself featured in the documentary alongside Herzog, who had his own connection to Flight 508. Werner was actually scheduled to be on the same flight as Juliane while he was in Peru scouting film locations. However, a last-minute change of plans meant that he was spared the fate of the others on LANSA's final flight. Juliane traveled back to the crash site with Werner and described it as a kind of therapy. Juliane went on to study zoology at the University of Kiel, graduating in 1980. She received her doctorate from Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich, returning to Peru to conduct research for her thesis. When discussing the Amazon, Juliane said, "I still love the rainforest. The truth is, for me it was never a green hell. When I plunged to earth from such a great height, the forest saved my life. Without the leaves of trees and bushes cushioning my fall, I never could have survived the impact on the ground. When I was unconscious, it screened me from the tropical sun, and later it helped me find my way out of the untouched wilderness back to civilization." Speaking of her life after the crash, Juliane said, "Of course I had nightmares for a long time, for years, and of course the grief about my mother's death and that of the other people came back again and again. The thought, why was I the only survivor, haunts me. It always will." In 2019, the government of Peru made Juliane a Grand Officer of the Order of Merit for Distinguished Services. She currently resides in Munich with her husband and works as a librarian at the Bavarian State Collection of Zoology. In 1989, Juliane married a German entomologist named Erich Diller, a specialist in parasitic wasps. Hans taught zoology at the University of Hamburg until his death in 2000, following which Juliane took over as the director of Penguana, and in 2011, Penguana was declared as a private conservation area, protecting it from clearing, hunting, and colonization. Juliane's autobiography, When I Fell from the Sky, was also released in 2011 and went on to win that year's Korean Literature Prize. Juliane Koepcke's story is one of extraordinary resilience and quiet strength. Surviving both a plane crash and the unforgiving Amazon rainforest, she has since dedicated her life to science and conservation. Though her story has inspired many, Juliane chooses to live away from the spotlight, finding peace in nature and continuing her work with a deep sense of purpose.